anthology by Breaking Rules Publishing. The anthology is called The Hollow, Where All Evil Things Lie. Okay. I start this story with a quote from MC Beaton. What sinks of iniquity these little villages can be. Ecstatic would be far too mild a term for how Steve Robertson felt as he ripped open the envelope that shot through his letterbox one Monday in late February. Inside was an invitation. It was written in splendid calligraphy on a piece of highly expensive watermarked paper. Clearly, the sender had a few pennies to throw around. The invitation was for something he had always wished for, a private viewing of an authentic Victorian model village. He had always hoped that somewhere in this country was a hidden gem, a lost relic, a park everyone had forgotten. And here in his hands was his wish. There is something quintessentially British about model villages, or miniature parks if you prefer. While the phenomenon is by no means exclusive to the British Isles, the concept of immaculately crafted miniature villages, often found in immaculate villages, seemed to captivate the British imagination. The idea of rendering a quaint snapshot of utopian village life in delightful 1.76 scale is so appealing to some that they join clubs and societies so they can meet others and share their little hobby. One such man was Steve Robertson, a 30-something computer programmer from West Sussex. All his life, he'd been fascinated by the craft that went into model villages. But it was also more than that. As a young lad, he'd been taken to his first miniature park in Babbacombe in Devon. And he'd become instantly spellbound. His first emotions were of deep unease. Something about the figures frozen in position while going about their daily lives struck him with the same disquiet that the taxidermy wing at the local museum did. But the more he looked, the more he became enthralled with the sense of order it represented. In an ever-changing and chaotic world, there was something to be envied in the villagers' static lives. They didn't have to worry about moving school when their parents separated as he did. They didn't have to worry about being beaten up for being the weird kid, like he did. They would never have to worry about where their next pocket money was going to come from. Steve's utopian dream of a village that never changed extended beyond miniature parks and soon took in model trains and aeroplanes. He could set up scenes in his garage that he could mentally inhabit when his life got tough. Until his dad came to stay and demanded the use of the garage, that is. As Steve got older, he put the train sets away, but his love of model villages remained. Throughout his childhood, every opportunity he got, he would visit one of the UK's many miniature parks. During one visit, he met a man who introduced him to the Model Village Preservation Society. His new friend told him of the rich history of miniature parks and how they initially started as a rich man's folly in the Victorian period. Many of the original models were scrapped, but some were open to the public, and by the 1930s, model villages had become something of a craze at holiday resorts. It was the Society's mission to restore and protect all of the UK's model villages. They ran the spectrum from the sublime to the god-awful and ensure that their survival for future generations. Such a noble goal appealed to Steve, as did free entry for life at selected parks. And he signed up straight away. Over the years, Steve slowly moved up through the ranks of the often competitive and cutthroat world of the Society. And now, in his 52nd year on Earth, he finally became treasurer. Like all societies, groups, gangs, and cults, there is a definite pecking order and a certain element of jealousy and politicking to be done. Steve had narrowly beaten his closest rival, James Hawthorne, to the top spot. Such a title came with an increased sense of responsibility, along with certain perks such as invitations to events and parks that were not open to the rank and file of the Society or the public at large. One such park he now held in his trembling hands. The invitation reads, Dear Mr. Robertson, I here invite you in your capacity as treasurer of the MVPS to visit the Green Family Miniature Park here in Battles Cove, North Cornwall. I have recently taken possession of my father's estate, and amongst the properties was the old workshop. The workshop had been the domain of my great-grandfather, and not many people have visited it since his passing. I went to view the property with an eye to selling it, but in the grounds I discovered a wonder. My great-grandfather had once proposed a major redevelopment of the town of Bettles Cove. He had built the model village to show off his plans. For whatever reason, the plans were vetoed, but the model remains as a testament to his vision. I decided at once to restore the model to its former glories, and after a year of painstaking work, I would like to invite you to be one of the first people in Britain, nay, the world, to visit the fully restored park. I enclose contact information and directions. I hope to hear from you presently. Sincerely, Archibald Green. Steve raced around his hole like a madman. It took a matter of minutes to fire off the RSVP letter on his computer, but then he needed an envelope. It struck him as being quaintly eccentric that Mr. Green should only include an address. There was no email address, no fax number, no mobile phone number even. Nobody outside of banks, councils and other people demanding money had used snail mail for decades, but he was too wrapped up in the moment to question it. Steve was so excited that he made himself late for work the first time in around 20 years because he got himself stuck in a queue at the post office. Not that anybody at his company noticed nor cared. Steve was tucked away in a basement office, tinkering with computers all day. Not many people actually knew he existed. After he had posted his RSVP, the agonizing wait began until the golden date of the 30th of April. Steve had booked his room in a bed and breakfast for the weekend and had already mentally packed despite it being over a month away. The fact that Mr. Green had chosen Wild Purgis night for the grand van viewing was a fact completely lost on Steve. Bettles Cove is a funny little town. It's changed very little over the years. Its position on the northwest coast of Cornwall, surrounded by steep hills and windswept forests, have seemingly sheltered it from the modernising influence of the rest of the country. Steve, like many people in Britain, had never even heard of the place before he saw it on Mr. Green's invitation. Over the long weeks he waited. The small fishing town became his promised land, his Mecca. It called to him across the country. April the 30th was wet and windy, as April days in Cornwall normally are. Steve had arrived mid-morning and had located the dated B&B that he was staying in. The tired decor and even more decrepit owner reminded him of black and white photographs he had seen of his dad's family holidays in the 1950s. Another aspect that would have struck people as slightly odd was the fact that Mr. Green insisted that the park only be viewed after sunset. He had explained in a letter confirming receipt of Steve's RSVP that the park looked much better after dark, and indeed included many lighting and atmospheric effects. After a catnap, Steve had showered, gotten dressed in a smart suit fit for such an auspicious occasion. He had then toddled out for a meal at a nearby gastropub before taking a walk around the town and purchasing a map of how Bettles Cove looks today, and finally heading to his destination. Mr. Green's workshop that housed the park was tucked away down a narrow side street off the esplanade in the old part of the town. Most of the traditional Cornish buildings had fallen into a state of disrepair, and a kind of sadness hung over the area like a shroud. The entrance to what was little more than an alley was partially hidden by a gigantic grinning cod that advertised the fish and chip shop to the left and the nets and pots of the bait shop to the right. One side of Fish Street was made up of back entrances to the various shops that formed the eastern side of the town square. The right-hand side was made up partially of the backs of shops. High metal fences dominated the remainder of the street, keeping people away from the potentially dangerous scrubland that led to the docks. The street was narrow and damp. Clusters of old soggy newspapers and cardboard boxes littered the gutter. Discarded chip trays and food wrappers provided a feast for rats and seagulls. Puddles slick with a rainbow of old oil leaked from an endless parade of rattling delivery vans gave the street a grimy, unwholesome feel. At roughly the centre of Fish Street lay Steve's destination, sticking out like a sore thumb. Amongst the ancient stone and rotting timbers of the rest of Bettles Cove stood an impressively stout building of Victorian design. Its crumbling red brick and rusted metal exterior loomed imposingly against the oncoming night sky and cast a lengthy shadow over the street. The wrought-iron door knocker thundered hollowly against the thick oak door. The noise startled a cat. The sharp blows echoed down the narrow street, inciting a straggly-looking marmalade cat to raise its hackles and spit in Steve's direction. There we go. The startled feline then ducked behind an overflowing metal bin and disappeared from view. After but a short while, the door creaked open, revealing the host for the evening. Steve's first impressions were of awe and slight amusement at the dedication that the man before him had given to the Victorian theme. Mr. Green was dressed in an overstarched wing-collar shirt, complete with a black tie and an impressive Windsor knot. The ensemble was completed with a battered frock coat and a pair of immaculately polished shoes. He was a tall, lanky individual that had a distinctly cadaver-like appearance. Mr. Green extended a long, bony hand and bade Steve a warm welcome. The vigour in his firm yet icy cold handshake dispelled any illusions of frailty. Good evening, sir. Glad you could make it. I trust you found me easily enough. Mr. Green spoke in a deep, sonorous voice that brought to Steve's mind Christopher Lee in Dracula. In fact, his whole aura was a touch Hammer horror. Good evening, Mr. Green. Indeed, I had no difficulty in locating you. Your directions proved more than adequate. Steve answered this gracefully, in keeping with the general air of Victoriana. Excellent. I'm glad you had no troubles. Bettles Cove can be a confusing place, despite its relatively small size, and Friday nights can get a little, how should I say, raucous. Green smiled, showing a set of nicotine-yellowed teeth. Oh, I think it's a charming little place, Steve said, rather too enthusiastically, and with a note of insincerity. Splendid, Green exclaimed. Then, without further ado, I welcome you to the Bettles Cove Miniature Park. Mr. Green ushered Steve inside the rundown workshop and into a sparsely furnished sitting room. Good, Green purred. Then, if you would care to follow me, we will have a sherry. Then I will show you to my ancestor's masterpiece. Green indicated a threadbare wingback chair and motioned for Steve to take a seat. Steve carefully lowered himself into the shabby chair. He was unsure that it would take his weight. Thankfully, it did. Steve scanned the walls. They were covered in designs and schematics, and a grand portrait of Queen Victoria dominated the room. After a moment or two, Mr. Green returned with a pair of delicate-looking crystal cut-glass sherry glasses and a crystal decanter. After he had poured them both a snifter, they raised their glasses and nodded politely before taking a sip. I have recently uncovered my ancestor's schematics and architectural plans for his proposed town development, Green explained, motioning to the designs on the wall. These designs became my template for the renovation of the model you will see momentarily. They could be of great historical value to one such as yourself, and I've laid some of the more interesting ones out in the next room for your general perusal. Thank you, Mr. Green, Steve said, trying to mask his excitement. Truthfully, though, this historical snapshot of an original Victorian model village had Steve salivating. They sounded fascinating. Sorry. They sound fascinating. I have visited many miniature parks, but it's not often that you get to peek behind the curtain, as it were. Excellent. Then, if you would care to follow me into the rear of the workshop, we can begin your tour. Green directed Steve to a highly arched doorway and into the back room. The rear of the crumbling workshop was lined on all walls with workbenches and woodworking tools of all shapes and sizes. Half-built buildings and various limbs of yet unfinished villages littered the benches. Mr. Green beamed with pride when Steve complimented him on the condition of his antique tools. With relish, he explained that they were the very tools used by his great-great-grandfather to create the original model village. Above the largest bench in the centre of the room hung an imposing portrait of the model village's creator, Mr. Randolph Green. The resemblance to Steve's host was uncanny. They could have been twins. After a few glorious minutes examining the delicate crafting tools and the detailed schematics, Mr. Green explained that he would now go and light the village in preparation. Before he hurried away to illuminate the park, he furnished Steve with another sherry, which he gratefully and thirstily attacked. Eventually, the wait was over. The gracious host returned, sporting a top hat and swinging ornate crystal-top cane. Steve thought this was a splendid bit of added theatre. With a booming voice, Mr. Green proclaimed, "And now, honoured guest, it is with great pleasure that I welcome you to the Bettles Cove Miniature Park." With an enthusiastic flourish, Mr. Green pulled the thick chain and parted the old wooden shutters. The mechanism rattled in a symphony of metal as the walls slid apart. Green removed his topper with a graceful motion and bent into a slick bow. With his cane, he motioned to the now unveiled park and boomed, "Behold!" like a classical musician. As Steve took his first eager steps outside, he gasped at the sight before him. A haze of atmospheric gaslight hung over the beautifully sculptured shrubs and hedges. Dry ice drifted along the lanes and roads. The park was indeed a scale model of Bettles Cove, but it was soon to become apparent this was a very different vision of the town. The moss-infested, crazy paving path approached the town from the eastern hills of Cornwall. Ancient trees enclosed the attraction. The shrubbery and rock gardens perfectly replicated the craggy countryside. The sea breeze, gently diffused by the wire fences and brick walls, gave the trees a life not often seen in model villages. The path snaked downwards between the simulated hills and towards the replica of the ancient church. Beautifully crafted lights, lit with Victorian ingenuity, surrounded the scale model of the church. The steeple, the stained glass windows, everything was sculpted with pinpoint accuracy. An atmospheric shadow from the steeple fell ominously over the replica graveyard that showed the age of the model. There was no near the number of graves and crypts that stood there today. The green outside the church stood in its original state, complete with the original greenhouse before the grand memorial to the dead of 2 world wars was constructed. As Steve stood admiring the replica church, a strange sense of disquiet fell over him. There was something slightly off about the scene. The steeple was adorned with a strange weather vane. Its odd design gave a distinct impression of a Kabbalistic design. There was no rooster to be seen, just a bizarre swirling pattern or symbol. Steve had seen a vast array of stained glass windows during the pursuit of his hobby, but none had been as strange as these. In place of the usual scenes of a religious nature, these seemed to depict scenes of strange vistas and star fields. To the centre of the graveyard, where a plethora of simple headstones now stood several rings of grand tombs, radiating outwards, and in the centre was a strange black monolith. Steve must have gasped or otherwise shown his shock at the striking design, as Mr. Green noticed his surprise. "Ah," Green purred. "I see you've spotted the monolith. You see, my ancestor was a man of science, and he firmly believed in the energies to be found at Betel's Cove. The town, you see, was so named after a meteorite struck the blasted crag, Betel being the ancient Greek name for sacred black stone, or meteorite. Hence the black monolith. The meteorite also gave the town its strange geological properties. It also said that it lies at a convergence of ley lines. There is more than one monolith in the model, and they are all placed on ley lines." "Fascinating," Steve beamed. "Indeed. My ancestor thought that he could somehow harness the power of these ley lines through conduits." "The black stones?" "Indeed, Mr. Robertson, indeed." "Is that why the church windows don't show the usual scenes?" Steve inquired. "Ah, that was just his little joke. He had initially planned to replicate the original windows, but after his plan was denied by the town council, he replaced them with his design. He was not a religious man, by any extent. Not conventionally religious, in any case." Green trailed off, a distant look in his eye. "Do you mean he was a witch or a pagan or something?" Steve raised an eyebrow quizzically. "Something like that, sir. You see, people around here at that time believed in the old ways. Some still do." Suddenly returning to Earth, Mr. Green beamed. "Shall we move on?" As the path wound on down past the graveyard and joined what was then a cobbled street, Steve couldn't shake his inexplicable pangs of unease. It was like the first time he visited a model park, but somehow different, more tangible. The town square lay off to the west as they branched along to the east. The path snaked around the grand town hall, complete with its original gardens and austerely garbed councillors milling around on the forecourt. It was there that Steve again experienced that strange, uncanny valley feeling that he had not felt since he was a boy. The assembled politicians were so lifelike that he had to pause and gaze in fascination at their gesticulating fingers. Randolph Green prided himself on his human sculptures, Steve's host began upon seeing the scrutiny of the miniature life below. He hated the, how shall I put this, cartoon aspect that many of his peers employed. He said, "What is the point of having people that don't look like people?" He developed his special technique so he could capture life, as he put it. "Well, he succeeded," Steve enthused. "I've never in all my visits to miniature parks seen such a realistic-looking people. Sir, your ancestor was an artist of the highest caliber." Mr. Green beamed, baring his yellow teeth in a joyous rictus. "Thank you, Mr. Robertson. It means a lot to know that my ancestor's craft is so greatly appreciated." Mr. Green's face took on a more dour expression. "Sadly, Not all of his creations have weathered time so well. He bent down and picked a stooped and twisted old woman off the ground. Take this, for instance. See how time and weather have bent her form? See how age has caused the face to slip and wither? It is a shame, the toll that time reaps on great art. Mr. Green gazed wistfully at the model. Then, with a startling display of ferocity, yanked the old lady in two. I have been studying his methods for creating the life models, he continued, tossing the broken woman into the bushes by the graveyard. I have begun replacing the most time-ravaged of the models, and hope to fully repopulate the town in the next few months. He slowly turned from the town hall and continued along the path. Where the bingo hall and a few shops and bars now stood, sat the original theatre in all its Victorian opulence. Steve could almost hear the music echoing from within. Directly across the road was the original hospital buildings. Mr. Green bemoaned the fact that they had been demolished and replaced by a block of soulless concrete, steel and glass. Further beyond the town hall lay the local pond. It was colloquially known as the Wallows. Clustered closely around the imitation pond were clusters of wood and granite houses of the type often found in Cornwall. The gambrel roofs and waterside verandas spoke of an idyllic fishing village scene of a bygone time. It struck Steve as slightly strange to see a community seemingly built with such reverence around a festering muddy pond. What was even stranger was the presence of another of the bizarre monoliths. It stood proudly in the dead centre of the pool. As Mr. Green directed them back towards the square, Steve noticed more and more of the unnervingly real figures. In front of the hospital, orderlies stretched the injured indoors. Doctors smoked on the bench to the rear. As they turned the corner to where the town square stood, Steve was startled to the extent of Randolph Green's proposed innovations. The square had been completely excavated down to sea level, and wide stone steps led down to the level of the underground tunnels and chambers below the current square. The underground river had been carved into channels that flowed around the sunken garden surrounded the centerpiece of the square, a huge clock tower inscribed with the Latin phrase, Pascare versata tempus tuam. Steve puzzled at the words for a moment, then turned to his host for clarification. Mr. Green, what does that mean? The inscription on the clock face, I mean. Ah, now, that was what my family motto. It means, feed me your wasted time. Green smiled. Ah, okay, Steve said, desperately trying to figure out what it meant. Mr. Green started to explain the thought behind the radical redesign of the square. Randolph had a village of Bettles Cove as being our Venice. He planned on using the existing underground rivers and tunnels, you see. But those narrow-minded councillors would have nothing of it. They were so bound up in tradition and illusions of safety that they sneered at his creation. Steve could detect a note of frustration and barely concealed anger as Green spoke. Yeah. When he said those narrow-minded councillors, he jabbed his bony forefinger in the direction of the town hall. A thought crossed Steve's mind that the councillors depicted over yonder could in all probability be representations of the very council that thwarted his town plan. Once his spleen had been suitably vented, Mr. Green pointed out the split-level shopping area with its meticulously detailed shops, businesses, and boutiques. The Ancient Mariner and the Caxton Arms public houses stood where they always had on the upper tier, but below was a vertical extension into the waterside that showed tables filled with drunken revellers. Another jolt of the uncanny startled Steve when he noticed that amongst the frock-coated masses were a smattering of people in contemporary dress. The modern figures, all huddled together on a single bench, they sat apart from the masses, towards the rear of the room. The modern figures were equally well crafted and detailed as the old ones, and Steve felt the need to compliment Mr. Green again. I'm really impressed. I take that the folk in modern dress are your handiwork, Mr. Green. Indeed they are, using my ancestors' methods, Green smiled with pride. They're amazing, Steve extolled. Just so lifelike. It's incredible. As he spoke, a strange realization dawned on him. He recognized one of the figures. Hold on, he yelped. That's Jim. He pointed towards the sullen figure in a cheap-looking suit standing in the far corner. Ah, Mr. Hawthorne, you mean? Yeah, James bloody Hawthorne. How on earth did that swine get into your model? He came to visit me a couple of weeks ago. Said you'd sent him. I thought it was a touch odd, but I let him have a little look. After he had been around the park, he expressed a desire to be immortalized, as it were. Bastard! Steve hissed under his breath. Mr. Green turned sharply to stare at him. Steve quickly cleared up the confusion. Oh, sorry, no, not you, Mr. Green. Mr. Hawthorne, I mean. James Hawthorne was Steve's biggest rival within the tightly knit community group of model village enthusiasts. Steve had known that he was jealous about his invitation to Bettles Cove, and while he didn't expect him to stoop to such underhand methods, he couldn't say he was surprised. Steve explained his annoyance to Mr. Green, who merely shrugged and offered to put his likeness in the village as well. Steve leapt at the opportunity to be a permanent figure in the amazing oddity. His host said that he would go and set up some equipment for capturing his likeness, and left him to survey the rest of the village alone. Left to his own devices, Steve wandered onwards, past the square. The harbour was almost as it remains today, except for the number of ships in dock. Bettles Cove had once been a bustling fishing town. Suddenly, those days were long gone. An artificial sea had been created that signalled the end of the model. To the south of the esplanade, where the modern-built dockyard stands, was a huge mound of earth, with another monolith on its summit. A sign saying, "The Altar of Jerigathy," signified that this strange hump, which looked suspiciously like a huge rubbish dump, held some kind of religious significance. As Steve meandered along the miniature esplanade to the north, a sort of peace fell upon him. Steve had always felt strangely serene when walking through the model parks. They exuded a calm that was sadly missing from their fully grown counterparts. Soon, Steve reached the north end of the town and the natural monument of the blasted crag. This geological wonder was the site of the meteor strike of which Mr. Green spoke earlier. What was startling about the crag was the addition of yet another of the huge black stones. Once Steve had finished his private viewing, he sedately ambled back towards the square. As he passed the Ancient Mariner, he couldn't help but stop and mutter an oath at his rival. Mr. Hawthorne's duplicity is still causing you anger, I see, sir. Mr. Green had reappeared from seemingly out of nowhere, making Steve jump out of his skin. Yes, sorry, Steve confessed. It's the underhandedness of its behaviour that really boils my sprouts. I understand, sir, Mr. Green consoled. I imagine it's the same sort of feeling that my family has felt since these plans were vetoed. If you like, we could get rid of Mr. Hall. Really? You would do that for me? Steve asked, somewhat jubilantly. Certainly, Mr. Green said with a grin. Here. He passed Steve the model James and motioned towards the simulated sea. Do what thy will. Steve peered down at the model of his betrayer and felt a cauldron of unfiltered hate bubbling up inside. With brutal efficiency, he bent and twisted the figure. Then with a pull, split the model in half. Steve would have been lying if he had said that he didn't get some kind of sense of great satisfaction from Mini James's destruction. Finally, he tossed the broken figure into the water with a satisfying splash. After the catharsis of killing James, Steve followed Mr. Green back to his workshop. Green then set about taking a set of photographs with an old Victorian box camera. It had a nitrate bulb. The pictures were of Steve standing and sitting. After the photo shoot, Green measured all of Steve's extremities and girth. All the while he worked, the old gentleman plied Steve with sherry. The air started to grow thick as Green toiled by candlelight. The sherry was beginning to make him feel all warm and fuzzy inside. Soon, Steve was carried off into the arms of Morpheus. Steve awoke the next day with his head feeling like a sack of rusty spanners. He was sitting at a table in a local pub, only it wasn't his local pub. It was the Ancient Mariner. Steve glanced around in confusion at the rows of tables filled with people from a wide variety of time periods. Soon the magnitude of the horror he had been thrust into became apparent. Steve was inside the model village. How Steve got here, stuck in this model, he will probably never know. Nobody here, for they too were alive, all of them, once, knew the methods used by the evil Randolph Green and his dastardly heir. The only thing that was for certain was that whatever method used was occult and forbidden in nature. The Greens worshipped a deity known as Jerigathi, the scavenger, the parasite god, and they fed him the wasted time of the people trapped in the model. Every day they the waste of their lives being stuck in that trap was a feast for the parasite. What Steve did know, however, was that he had murdered James. He was forced to live with the gnawing guilt that came from the realization that his symbolic killing of James had nothing symbolic about it. There was no escape from that strange prison. No escape, save for that one that only came when Mr. Green reached out his bony fingers for you. The end. Thank you. Well, that could have been worse. I only fluffed up a couple of times. Yeah. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to open up for a Q&A. So if anybody out there has any questions about the story or me in general, go for it. I've just seen one comment. It's from my friend Jay Cooper in Albany, New York. So here we go. Sausage. Okay, right. Yeah. The Hollow is out now. You can find it on Amazon. If you look below this here video screeny thing, you will find a little universal link. So wherever you are in the world, you'll be able to find it. It's really nice, glossy, shiny, pretty. Right, let's have a look. If there's been any questions. Thanks, Claire. Thanks, Trisha. Thanks, Patty. Thanks, Marion. Oh, cheers, Ren. Is there actually any questions? No, like I say, if there's any questions, go for it. Okay, I may as well just tell you about that story. The kernel for that story came. Obviously, I've been reading a lot of Lovecraft lately. But the kernel of it came from I actually went to that very same miniature park, but model miniature park. I hate that term. Model village in Babbacombe, Devon. I went there as a kid. And I remember I can still remember it vividly. There's a little like a village square, and there's a church sort of off to the side, and there's a little post office. And outside this post office is a little woman with like a parcel, and she looks like she's going to drop it. And next to it's a window cleaner, and he's sort of halfway up, and he's holding his chamois. He's like bubbles dripping down his arm. Don't know why. There's something about it freaked me out. And all these years later, when I was like thinking about what can I write, I don't know. I just thought about that snapshot. Yeah, yeah. So that's where that came from. Yeah, I have already said that. I've already just done that. In case you missed it, it's in there in the Hollow from Breaking Rules Publishing. You can find the link, the Amazon link to it, just below. I'm also in their horror magazine, their March. So last month's horror magazine, their story Guided by the Light. Okay. Yeah, you're not wrong, Claire. Claire Kennard comments, great job, Tim. Really hard to read out loud, let alone to the whole world. Yeah. I've been really blasé about it all week. I'll be fine. I'll be fine. Never done this before. And yeah, dry throat. You may have noticed it was like, nervousness dries your mouth out. So yeah, I was like chewing cotton about halfway through it. But I think it could have gone a lot worse. So there was only one major bit where I completely corpsed, and that's because somebody sitting on the sofa over there was tapping. It really distracted me. Hey, there we go. There's Mike. Yeah, Mike GH asks if that was my first live reading. Am I going to do more? I think I should. I really, once I got past the original, that first few paragraphs was horrible. I seriously, I was like, oh no. If there's ever going to be a time where some Lovecraftian horror from the dawn of time comes in and drags me under the floor, it should have been then. But yeah, I do intend on doing more because I've got quite a lot of stuff out there. I think I was talking to because there's different marketers for different bits in Breaking Rule Publishing. And I know Jennifer Gordon is looking to do stuff for the magazine, so I'll probably end up doing that. But it's something I'd like to do for a lot more stuff. Obviously, you'll have to it'd be on a permissiony thing, like because quite a lot of it's under contract. But yeah, I would love to do it again. I really enjoyed it. I think I've got this set up quite cool. So, like I say, could have been a lot worse. Oh, have a large gin. Well, this is a very large beer. So, cheers. Sorry, just a funny comment. Where's the major pillory you promised us, Claire, again? Well, nothing actually went drastically, horribly, horrifically wrong. I thought it was all going to, like, go at some point. Me and technology don't usually get on very well, but it behaved remarkably well tonight. But if you pillory you're after, as soon as I finish doing this, because everything's set up, I'm going to record like the first Release the Bats podcast. I used to do podcasts a long time ago for a different night I used to run, but I'm sulking because I can't do my regular Saturday thing. So, podcast, best thing. So, yeah, again, I mean, that's what brought this on was the fact that I was looking into doing some appearances because they authors do this whole thing. They turn up, they read their story, and then take a Q&A kind of thing. But yeah, and this was the nearest thing I could do, and it was with Trisha McKee. So yeah, talking to her about it, and some guy called Trent who was also on the Breaking Rules thing. But yeah, we basically put it together between ourselves, me and Trisha, pretty much. So thanks, Trish. Yeah, and yeah, that's kind of how it went about. It basically came about because I'm sulking. Like I imagine most people's lockdown stuff is because they're sulking. So yeah. Right, let's have a look. Oh, thanks, Patty. There's so much fun listening to you to you reading your very own story. Fantastic reading. Yeah. Yeah, it's a good question, Mike. Not really. Mike asks if you're getting any writing inspiration from the craziness that's going on at the moment. Not really. I mean, that whole it's not really my area. I don't know. I don't know. I don't really do virusy kind of outbreaky kind of stuff. I mean, I tend to stick to the more sort of cosmic horror, macabre kind of thing. I basically I like taking household objects and making them murderous. So I've got a story coming out in May, I think it is, uh, about killer oysters. That'll give you some kind of indication of where my ideas come from. I've got a novella coming out as well on Black Hair Press. That's coming out this year at some point. And that came from a ridiculous idea I had of what if Day of the Triffids was written by H.P. Lovecraft and then turned into a film by Simon Pegg and Edgar Wright. So yeah, think Day of the Triffids, Color Out of Space meets Hot Fuzz. Yeah, and I've got another one which is basically like Agatha Christie meets the Mummy with Nyarlathotep. Yeah, I'm, and I tend to prefer, and I do a lot of psychological stuff as well. I mean, I've got one coming out in an anthology, which is probably the darkest thing I've ever written. It'll be out in It Calls from the Forest, which is coming out next month on the 15th, I believe. I've got two in that. One of them isn't very much so isn't the darkest thing I've ever written, and one of them is. So it's interesting. I'm looking forward to it because it's going to be two very very polar opposite sides of my writing, like back to back kind of thing. One is really dark, twisted, bit of a head, and the other one's a bit of a ridiculous romp. But it's a pile of it. Anyway, okay. Yeah, Claire, like I say, yeah. Claire says she misses Release the Bats. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Okay, Ellie. I'll take that. Also, great. Ellie says, also great background, but with a ring light, it'd be a good balance of illumination. uh, Mike, yeah. Do I sit down? Mike asks, do I sit down and write every day? Do I have a routine or does stuff to pop up and take notice of something? Pretty much. All of the above. I do write every day. Uh, Sometimes more than others. I have notebooks all over everywhere. I've got three. I've got one in my pants pocket right now. I've got one in my coat. I've got one in my CD bag. I've got one next to the bed. I've got about four down the arm of the chair. Uh, yeah, because inspiration could come any time. But I do write pretty constantly. Uh, yeah, I've done. Well, put it like this: since January last year, I've done one and two-thirds of a novel, four novellas, and I don't know the exact number, but about 35, 40 short stories. So yeah, I'm a bit obsessive with things, as you will know if you ever see my record collection. If I get some kind of obsession, then that's it. You know, but it's good. It keeps me sane. It keeps me off the streets, especially now. Okay, good. Karen replies, "That was great fun, though the hissing cat was a tad startling. I leapt back and nearly fell off the bed." Brilliant. That was what I was aiming for. A lot of my other story, I mean, that's not really, I mean, that's the only place I could have done one in that. But a lot of my other stuff does have places where I could put jump scares, which actually is something interesting. Because I watch a lot, always have. I watch a lot of really bad tragic horror movies. Like the crapper the better. And they've always got these really like jump scare stuff, right? And I was like, well, how the hell do you do that? And I actually read an article. I can't remember who it was, but it was about. I mean, one of the examples was Shirley Jackson, The Haunting of Hill House. It was basically like, how do you write a jump scare? How do you do it? And from that, I learned some breathing. I learned a lot of breathing techniques, which sounds like esoteric mumbo jumbo, but it works. Um, for suspenseful moments, long paragraphs, long sentence, like really long sentences. The example was something like it was Haunted Hill House, and it was something ridiculous, like 105 words sentence or something. I don't know. I can't remember it, but it was ridiculous. It was a ridiculous number. It probably wasn't quite that high, but it makes you hold your breath because even when you're reading in your head, you still read like I just did. You know, you still read that in your head like that. So if you want people to hold their breath, long sentences. So what you do is you put long sentence, long sentence, long sentence, and then you go for short sentences, even one word, because it makes you pant. So you go, that's the way to do it. I mean, that's the only way to do it. I thought it was really good advice, and it seemed to work. Um, I mean, some of the stuff I've written since I learned that, yeah, very good. Uh, yeah, we all miss bats, dude. uh, okay, are we done? It, uh, see if I missed any comments up here. Yeah, thanks. Yeah. Okay. Ankle Biters, the worst vampire film ever. Black Sheep. I love Black Sheep. I love Black Sheep. I don't know what you quite mean by that. No, never mind. Oh, are you giving me like inspiration here? Like rubbish vampire movies and Black Sheep. That could work. I could do that. Anyway, it looks like that's Nobody's really commenting now. It pretty much covered most of the questions. Uh, so, yeah, thank you for tuning in. And I fluffed it a couple of times, but it could have been a lot worse. So I'm pleased with it. I'm happy. I'm going to drink a couple of beers and record a podcast. Thank you very much for tuning in. I really love it if you join me again. I will do this again. I'll speak to some of the people I have things published with. I enjoyed it. I had fun. Thank you.